Is the aviation industry about to run out of engineers and aircraft mechanics? I have made a lot of videos lately covering the pilot shortage, but if anything, the world's shortage of mechanics and engineers might actually be a lot worse, and solving that for the long term will actually be both harder, costlier, and also potentially take years. Stay tuned. In Greece, about an hour's drive north of Athens, there's a sleepy village called Tanagra with a not-so-sleepy military base next to it. Besides its military units, the base also houses a maintenance, repair and overhaul facility, or MRO for short, which handles military aircraft. The state-owned company which is based there is called EAB, and it's also an aerostructure subcontractor for Lockheed Martin and also a few others. But one new job that this MRO facility has recently taken up is to upgrade all of Greece's F-16 fighter jets and fit them with modern radars and other avionics. Now that's a big job. The program was originally scheduled to be finished by 2027. But that schedule is now looking very uncertain because the MRO is reportedly struggling with their staff numbers, in particular the 150 mechanics that they need in order to complete these upgrades. But it's not recruiting the mechanics that is the main problem. No, the issue actually is retaining them. A lot of their mechanics simply quit after their initial 12-month contract ends, which is a huge headache for the company, both financially and in terms of lost time. You see, hiring replacements for these people who leave involves not only training them on the aircraft type and systems involved, it also requires very detailed and time-consuming background checks and security vetting of each and every one of them, since of course they will be dealing with sensitive military equipment. One manager in the MRO company labeled this trend as a vicious cycle, and he also said the workers get their training and their costly certifications for the job, and then they leave to work for large aviation companies in Belgium and Norway. And those are of course countries that also have the F-16s. Now, the short 12-month duration of the contracts, plus the time lost in vetting and training, means that these mechanics rarely get far beyond their initial course before they choose to just pick up and leave. But why are they leaving? Well, we obviously can't know everyone's circumstances for sure, but a big clue might lay in the money. You see, each one of these mechanics are reportedly paid only around 900 euros per month, with an overtime pay of just 2.5 euros extra per hour. Now, I don't know how much these mechanics would get paid for these jobs in Belgium or Norway, but I think it's probably safe to say that it's likely quite a bit more than that. At this point, some of you might wonder how relevant this seemingly local problem really is to the aviation industry as a whole, especially the commercial side of it, and the answer turns out to be very. Because actually, all airlines, aircraft manufacturers, MROs and others in the industry compete to hire these same aircraft mechanics and engineers. There are plenty more examples of these same type of problems much closer to the airliner world, and for the next one, we will need to look no further than a company that has been heavily featured in recent videos on this channel, Boeing. In 2019, Boeing's management approached the 751st District of International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers Union, or AIM 751 for short, whose members work at Boeing's major manufacturing and assembly sites in the Seattle area. And Boeing had a very unusual but pretty straightforward question to ask them. Should we pay you a little bit more money? Now, while I'm sure that the real conversation was a little bit more complicated than that, the main thing here is that it was Boeing who initiated those talks, and they did want to offer better pay to their unionized workers. And that is incredible and actually quite ironic if you consider the long and bitter conflict that Boeing and its unions had gone through the last time they negotiated. As I explained in my recent series about Boeing's fall from grace, back in 2013 and 14, the then Boeing CEO, Jim McNerney, basically waged an all-out war with the company's worker unions in general and AIM 751 in particular. There had been some lengthy strikes before this, but in 2014 the union's contract was up for renegotiation. In those talks, McNerney threatened the IAM union workers, saying that if they didn't agree to massive cuts, he would build Boeing's next jet, the Boeing 777X, away from Everett and the rest of the Washington state. In the end, McNerney won that fight. The union workers had little to no negotiating power and were therefore forced to make a lot of painful concessions, including giving up their company pensions. But as I explained in the Boeing series, Boeing's management might have won that particular battle, but ultimately they are losing the war. Now, I explained how destructive the whole idea of turning your workers into your enemy really is and how it ultimately impacted Boeing's development of the 737 MAX as well as other aircraft. But before all of this became public knowledge, Boeing had actually already approached the IAM union, again, for those talks already back in 2019. The reason for that was, as I'm sure that you've already guessed by now, Boeing had some real problems with both recruiting and holding on to their workers. As Liham News reported, especially in the lower tiers, Boeing's junior workers were quitting their jobs left, right and center because they could actually get better pay just fixing cars or even working in bars. So why is this happening? Well, the story in Greece that I mentioned in the beginning is recent, but Boeing's struggles to find enough new workers started already back in 2019, before the pandemic, so it doesn't seem to be a completely new thing. And the question also arises, is this all really a question of pay? Well, as it turns out, no, it is not. Pay is certainly a part of it, but the problem actually goes way deeper than that. You see, aircraft mechanics and engineers are getting older as a group, or at least they were, and I explain what I mean by that after this. We live in a super weird time right now, where it feels like our personal information is less secure than ever, with at least my phone overflowing with spam, phishing attempts and robocalls. And it turns out that there is a reason for that. You see, there's a whole industry out there known as data brokers, whose whole business idea is to harvest and sell your personal data to the highest bidder, which might well be a cyber criminal. But that's where today's sponsor, Incogni, comes in. You see, it is possible to ask these data brokers to remove your data from their records, but you normally have to do so one by one and manually. Incogni will instead reach out on your behalf and start cleansing your data from these brokers and also ensure compliance. And on top of that, they will also continuously scan and remove your data from any new companies for as long as you keep their service. Since I started using them, they have removed me from 66 different sites, and it has really made a difference. So if you want to shield yourself against spam, identity theft and erase your data from dubious people search sites, well then use the link here below, which is incogni.com/mentornow. And if you use the code mentornow when you sign up, you will also get an exclusive 60% discount on the annual plan. Thank you, Incogni. Now back to the video. The difficulty that the whole aviation industry is facing when it comes to engineers and mechanics actually goes back several years. Back in 2017, a study looked at how the engineers and mechanics seemed to be aging faster than workers did in other jobs. In the United States, the average age of an aviation mechanic was then about 51 years old, which was 9 years more than the average of the country's general workforce. And worse, the same study also showed that the number of people who leave jobs related to aircraft maintenance are way higher than the number of new workers that are actually coming in. So why is this happening? Well, at this point, it might actually be useful to compare these jobs to those of, for example, an airline pilot. Depending on where in the world, which school and what type of training a pilot chooses, getting an air transport pilot license or ATPL might cost between $60,000 and $110,000. And once started, it takes at least between 1.5 years and 2 years to then complete that training, and sometimes it can take even longer if you go down the modular route. Now, those costs don't include things like living expenses during training or a type rating for the specific airline that you might end up working on, so it can actually become even more expensive than that in the end. Obviously, that is a substantial investment in both money and time, and a pilot's first flying job often doesn't pay the kind of money that it will later on in their career. But that longer-term promise of a higher pay later on is at least something that junior pilots can look forward to. The situation is quite different for new mechanics and engineers. Financially, getting an engineering degree is cheaper than getting an ATPL. But time-wise, getting these qualifications generally takes more time, and it obviously still represents a significant investment and commitment for a young person to do. After that, again depending on location and other circumstances. Pay for junior engineers is normally on a much lower scale than that of pilots, and lower still if you look at other technical jobs in the industry. Now, especially for machinists and technicians, there is also another, more general problem. In many parts of the world, there is a tendency for people to idealize multi-year academic studies ahead of training for more technical, manual jobs, even if there is a bigger demand for those type of jobs. And for those who still choose engineering and technical aviation jobs, they often find that their new roles come with some really demanding working conditions. This includes long working hours, frequent changes in working location, as well as demanding schedules with last-minute changes. And all of this has often to be done out on the ramp, which is hot, cold, wet and windy, again for a relatively low pay. In short, these are very demanding jobs, and this has of course led to the roles having less and less appeal to young people. Meanwhile, the world's airline fleets are growing, meaning that the airlines need more and more people to maintain those multitude of aircraft, so maybe you can start to see the issue here. In 2017, there were a bit over 25,000 active commercial aircraft in service around the world, and at that time the industry expected that the fleet was going to grow to around 35,500 airliners by 2027, and that was even after taking account for the retirements of older jets. That was a 40% increase in the fleet size in just 10 years. And this was one of the main reasons that I have been warning about the looming pilot shortage ever since then. But, spoiler alert, it now turns out that the fleet growth will actually be a bit slower, for at least a while anyway, because production numbers after 2020 still haven't fully recovered yet. But that relief won't be as dramatic as you might think, because the airlines are now maintaining their numbers by keeping all the jets around for longer. Anyway, I have explained in some previous videos that I did how the 2010s was a very busy decade for both the aircraft manufacturers and the airlines. And to appreciate just how busy, you just need to look at the list of aircraft variants that were either updated or replaced during those 10 years. The Boeing 787, the Airbus A320neo, the 737 MAX, the Airbus A350, the A330neo, and even the Embraer E2 series all entered service during the 2010s. And these jets obviously needed more mechanics, machinists and engineers to first build them, and then even more of them to eventually maintain them. So to recap, on the one hand, we have mechanics and engineers that are getting older and harder to find because the jobs that they do aren't as appealing as they once were. And on the other side, the numbers of planes are constantly going up. Now obviously the whole industry could see this growth coming, so that's why at the end of the last decade everyone, including jet engine makers, Airbus and, as we've already seen, Boeing, were scrambling to both hire new engineers and mechanics and also make sure that they didn't lose the ones they already had. But that was before 2020. As soon as the pandemic hit, suddenly all of those companies who had been previously fighting to steal engineers and mechanics away from each other were now firing and furloughing people who they suddenly couldn't afford to pay. Again, highlighting just the volatility of this type of job. But the pandemic turned out to only provide a temporary lowering of demand. It obviously didn't mean that the fundamental shortages in these jobs were magically just going away. Just as we saw with pilots who went from a small shortage to a huge surplus and now to an even bigger shortage, mechanics and engineers were soon back in demand again, urgently. Remember how I said before that the airlines are now having to keep all the jets around for longer to make up for the slow deliveries of their newer toys? Well, do you know what older jets need more of compared to newer jets? Yes, maintenance, along with more spare parts, and of course all of the maintenance technicians and engineers needed to swap those parts and make sure that this work is done properly. Here it's also worth bearing in mind that when airlines are transitioning from an older to a newer aircraft type, this process takes several years, and in that time they need technicians and engineers qualified to maintain and repair both the old and the new types. And this means needing people with different skill sets. For example, newer types like the Boeing 787 and the Airbus A350 will need people that are skilled in working with large composite structures and lithium batteries, for example. While older types like the 767 still need technicians that can maintain and inspect hydraulics and other, let's say, legacy systems. Another joker in the pack, in the past few years at least, has been the matter of cargo aircraft. In 2020 and 2021, demand for both new cargo aircraft and passenger-to-freighter conversions basically exploded. And because of the sudden influx of cash into the cargo companies, they suddenly wanted to use that to replace their older jets, just increasing the need for engineers and mechanics even more, but again with different skill sets, those that could actually do those conversions. So where does all of this leave us then? Well, more recent employee surveys shows that actually the average age of mechanics doesn't seem to be rising as much anymore. From an average of 51 years back in 2017, newer surveys show that the age average now hovers around 40 years instead. But that's pretty misleading because the overall numbers of total mechanics are down. So what this actually shows is that a lot of older, experienced mechanics retired early in 2020, just like many older pilots did. The same survey shows that only 27% of mechanics are under the age of 30, which shows that the new intake of younger mechanics is still way too low. So what can the industry do then to reverse this trend, and how quickly can they do it? Well, here's where we have some more bad news, because according to these analysts, this problem hasn't actually peaked yet. The aviation mechanic shortage could continue to get even worse than this all the way until 2026 or 27. In 2023, there was a shortfall of 12,000 to 18,000 aviation maintenance workers, only in North America, and by 2027, that shortfall could be 43,000 workers, with the worst case being 48,000. To keep that from happening, researchers are now trying to figure out how to make this sector more attractive to the Gen Z workers. One hope is that the news of mounting student loans and increases in other living costs will limit the appeal of lengthy college and university degrees, making key qualifications like mechanics and machinists more attractive. Also, at the moment, only 6.9% of aircraft mechanics in the United States are women. As with pilots, the industry can gain a lot by making these technical professions more attractive to the 50% of the population that hasn't traditionally been targeted for them. But I think that I have actually found an even more effective solution. Just pay them more money and make sure that their working conditions, rosters and employment safety is improved. Until these worrying trends are reversed, everyone in aviation will suffer the consequences. And as a pilot, I can honestly say that I really want a happy, motivated and skilled mechanic and engineers working on my aircraft. These people, in my view, are magicians that can fix even the most complicated problems in a matter of hours, and without them, no one will be flying anywhere. Rant over. For the airlines, especially those who have chosen to hang on to their older jets, a scarcity of engineers and mechanics will undoubtedly mean more flight cancellations and, in the end, higher ticket prices. For the manufacturers, these same problems will mean issues with previously planned production increases, and of course, a lack of trained workers gives worker unions a much stronger negotiating position, which we are already seeing the effects of today. Airbus has just finished renegotiating their contracts with the IAM union chapter responsible for those working in the Airbus A220 final assembly facility in Mirabel, Quebec in Canada. This 5-year contract will bring a 23% increase in pay with better insurance, overtime compensation and a lot of other improvements to their terms, which frankly is about time. As for Boeing, like I said in my recent series about them, that contract that devastated the IAM union back in 2014 is up for renegotiating this September, now with Boeing as the one with very little negotiating power. Finally, with this topic, I want to take the opportunity to address something that some of you guys have been persistently writing about in the comment section: possible issues involving DEI hiring. Now, I might come back to this in another video, but for now, consider this. Aviation mechanics and engineers are just some of the many jobs where experience is vitally important and very difficult to replace. And many of these jobs featured en masse retirements of very senior, experienced employees during 2020 for many different reasons. That meant that when the industry recovered, replacing all of these experienced people with young talent had to be done quickly and with less supervision from the previous experienced generation. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't any issues connected with DEI politics in general, but maybe, just maybe, these issues of A generally lower experience level and a lack of older mentors are actually a bigger factor in some of the problems that we're seeing today, rather than the ethnic background, gender, or other characteristics of the people that are coming in. Worth thinking about. In any case, I think it's about time that the conditions improve for these, some of the most valued and least seen members of the aviation family. Let me know what you think in the comments here below, and please join my Patreon crew if you want to support me and also to discuss this further. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.